Hello, my name is Braden Smith, and I interviewed a war veteran by the name of Harold Terpstra. He told me all about his story and what his experience was like at Vietnam. He's going to talk about, first of all, how people didn't respect him before he went to Vietnam, and even after Vietnam, which surprised me, how people treated him for going to Vietnam. He's going to talk about what it was like going into the Army and getting drafted. He's going to talk about why he thinks that Vietnam happened, what he thinks the root of the problem is, which, let me be clear, this is just one man's opinion. This is his perspective, which I'm not saying he's wrong. He brings up some very good facts, and I definitely believe him, but it is still one man's perspective. And he's going to talk about what his role was and the role that other people played. He tells us that going to Vietnam, it emphasized teamwork, just like every place does, but especially in the Army, they emphasize teamwork. He's also going to talk about his most vivid memory, which is coming home. And everyone at Vietnam, everyone in the war, there was a needed comfort that everyone really needed. Especially afterwards, there are people with PTSD, but one thing that he was comforted in was his faith, and he's going to talk about that. So let's get into it. All right, so the first question I have for you is, what was the most important historical event in your life?
Well, I guess it would have to be going to Vietnam, going into the Army, and then eventually serving in Vietnam. But when I turned 18, I was still in high school. And so then after high school, I went to college for 1 year, and then I quit. And then the draft board caught up to me after I quit college, because if you were going to school, either high school or college, you had what they call a student deferment from the draft. But once I quit college, then that student deferment went away, and then I was eligible for the draft. And the draft board caught up with me in '68, because '67 I was in college, because I graduated from high school in '66. '67 I was in college. Then in '60, after I quit going to school, and then the draft caught up with me in '68.
Gotcha.
And so I was drafted in March of, I was drafted in February, and then went into the Army on March 7th in 1968. I knew people of my age that didn't think that the Vietnam conflict was something that they wanted to participate in. And I knew of 2 or 3 people that went to Canada to avoid the draft.
Oh, wow.
And the term we called them people were draft dodgers. All right. And then in 65 and 75, after the Vietnam conflict was brought to an end, and then President Ford gave amnesty to the people that left the country to avoid the draft, and so they could come back home. But the circumstances, as far as I was concerned, I had no intention. Of what we called dodging the draft, because I felt that it was my duty to serve.
Yeah.
Being a citizen of this country. And so there was no way that I was going to circumvent any of that and not go into the service.
Yeah, I think it was really cool what Mr. Terpstra had to say about the draft dodgers, but actually the reason that there were so many draft dodgers was because before that, in World War II, there were all these men that they just wanted to have families, they wanted to have babies, and so when World War II ended, that's exactly what happened. These men got out and they started families, they had a lot of kids, and there was a huge increase in population. and that generation was then known as the baby boomers. And the baby boomers were actually the reason that there were so many eligible men to go to Vietnam. There were 27 million eligible men that were eligible to go to Vietnam, but more than half of those men were either deferred, exempt, or disqualified from going to Vietnam. Another thing that happened was on August 26th of 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed an order that ended the exemption of all married men. So this meant that if you got married after August 26th of 1965 and you were eligible to go to Vietnam, then being married wouldn't stop you, essentially. And so this meant a couple things. First of all, it meant that I'm sure there were a ton of people that were trying to get married by August 26th, midnight at August 26th, 1965. So there's a ton of men rushing to get married, but this also meant that if you missed that date, if you couldn't get married by then and you got married after then, it probably made draft dodging a lot more desirable. And so this is part of the reason why there was such an increase in draft dodging.
Usually a worrisome situation for parents.
Yeah.
You know, because what was going on is that there was, during the Vietnam War, there was a considerable amount of casualties. A number of, I went to school with some guys that were drafted that didn't come home.
Oh man.
And I seen, you know, the situations to where, yeah, it was going to be, without a doubt, a make or break moment for most people.
Yeah.
So, upon being drafted, every soldier, everybody that gets drafted,
Yeah.
first thing is being sworn into the Army, making a pledge towards the Constitution,
Yeah.
you know, to defend the Constitution. And then we go through a period that we call basic training. Now that was a period, that was 8 weeks of training in the Army. That was an awful lot of physical dexterity, but then a certain amount of actual training of, let's say one of the things was how to read a map, not typographical, I don't know the term, but where a map is laid out to where the actual terrain of the territory, hills, valleys, mountains, it's all laid out, and you're given an assignment that you're at point A and you got to be at point B, and you have to look at the terrain that's in between those 2 points, and you have to figure out the best way to get there. Okay. The easiest, and you know, that's all the training that was in basic training. And then the next part was called advanced individual training, meaning that they would select a job for you. That was called, the term there was MOS. What it means, I do not know. MOS. And they assigned me an MOS, and the term for my MOS was petroleum supply and distribution.
Petroleum.
And what my job was is to learn all about how to transport, how to store, how to distribute a petroleum, and then along with that is ammunition. Because my job in Vietnam was that I refueled and rearmed helicopters. And helicopters was the lifeblood of Vietnam. Practically nothing went on in Vietnam without helicopters being involved in one way or another.
And that's what the petroleum was used for.
That's what petroleum, the jet fuel, and that was first of all transporting the fuel, storing the fuel, and then putting together systems, putting together the pumping systems and the petroleum lines to get the fuel to the helicopters along with the ammunition that was required to keep everything going. And that was my job over in Vietnam, to make sure that there was a situation, a procedure in Vietnam, that a helicopter was no farther than 6 minutes away from refuel and rearm, regardless to where they were at. And it was my company's job to when an operation was designated and they figured out that it was farther than 6 minutes away to refuel and rearm a helicopter, it was my job, along with the people that I worked with, to go somewhere and set up what we call a temporary system. And we would go in for 4 or 5 days, and while the helicopters were operating in that area, we had set up a refuel and rearm depot out in the middle of the jungle. And those were the hairiest parts. The bases that we operated, the regular flight lines that we operated, they were all confined in a perimeter. They had bunkers, they had berms around the base, guard shacks around the base, and those were all relatively secure. Doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't stuff happening on occasion, but that going out and setting up a temporary system out in the middle of nowhere was one of my jobs. But I've seen a number of things in Vietnam that were contrary to common sense. We had a policy in Vietnam of if you weren't being fired upon, you couldn't do nothing about it. We would see, there were occasions where I've seen in South Vietnam, I seen regulars, Army of North Vietnam in the country, in the vicinity, and yet we couldn't do anything about it because they weren't being aggressive. Not at that time. But they would definitely get aggressive later on, the next day or the next night or something like that. I would look back on some of those occasions as probably being a person that I consider myself to have a fairly reasonable sense of right and wrong, of responsibility, and of making sense out of stuff. And there were definitely times during that particular period of time in my life when I was over in Vietnam that it called into question whether the people in charge actually knew what the heck they were doing.
Yeah, of course.
My opinion is that unlike, it's not any different than my parents.
Yeah.
My wife and my oldest daughter was born while I was over in Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
But the circumstances were is that she was concerned that I wouldn't make it home.
Yeah.
And being a family of faith has a great deal to do with that. Being a person of faith had a great deal to do. One of my favorite stories about Vietnam was that I just indicated a few minutes ago about having to go out and set up a temporary fare system. That's what we called it. The night before I was to go out on my very first mission, after being in Vietnam for only a week, and I kind of thought I was being tossed, I was taken out of the frying pan and thrown into the fire. I was packing my clothes to go for 2 or 3 days. I was into a duffel bag. And while I was packing, I'd taken clothes out of my foot locker and my Bible fell on the floor. And during the course of a day or so, I was very anxious and very caught, about having to do this. All right. But when my Bible fell out on the floor, and I picked that Bible up, and then I remembered everything that I have been taught through my parents and all my reading of the Bible, and that I'm not in control. God's in control.
Yeah.
If I hadn't have made it back from Vietnam, I would, without a doubt, believed that that's what God had in mind. There was no doubt in my mind. So what I was doing, living my faith in Vietnam and ever since then. I think that going to Vietnam and successfully navigating that particular juncture of my life give me the confidence to know that regardless to what I wanted to do, I could do. And that's the confidence that I've had ever since then, all along.
What would you say was your most vivid memory of this event of Vietnam?
I'd have to say coming home. I did everything during the course that I was in Vietnam. I did everything that was asked of me. I did maybe in some cases a little bit more. Not that I want to say that I was any braver than anybody else.
Yeah.
But the circumstances is that once I made it to getting on my freedom bird, and that's what we called it. When you're getting ready to leave Vietnam, there is the embark and debark area was Long Binh, all right, big airstrip, and 350 guys were slated to go out on that particular morning, and then the big airliner came in and landed, and we knew that was our freedom bird, that the next step for us was going to be getting on that plane and coming home. And then you could look back and say, yeah, I made it. That was the most significant part, coming home.
Yeah.
Knowing that I was within days or hours of seeing my wife and my baby daughter, and the rest of my family too, not that they weren't important, but.
He told us that his most vivid memory was coming home in that Freedom Bird 747 plane, and I can definitely see why. I did some research and found that 44.3% of veterans reported low homecoming support. And I'm sure a lot of people also came home with a lot of PTSD, depression, and suicidal thoughts. Like we will find out very soon, a lot of these people that came home from Vietnam were treated with just lots of scorn and just treated poorly in general. Along with that, 304,000 came home wounded. All this to say that for some people, the war wasn't the only hard part.
But the Vietnam War didn't deter me from going into the service. In fact, it might have been an encouragement to me, because I was then, and I am still today, very patriotic. The flag means an awful lot, and there's a number of occasions over the past a number of years, especially right after I came home from Vietnam, that there were quite a few protests and stuff like that, anti-war protests, and there were some situations that I got involved in because I had seen people disrespecting our country and disrespecting our flag, and I actively got out of my vehicle and did something about it. One of the probably my biggest situation is that during a period of time, the public had a very low opinion of Vietnam War and of the people who fought in Vietnam. We consider when we, the veterans of Vietnam, greet each other today, regardless to where we're at, one of the first things we say is welcome home. Because when we were coming home during the 60s and the 70s, the public didn't welcome us home. We were despised in some cases. We were called baby killers. We were all kinds of things. Doesn't necessarily mean that some guys didn't do very stupid things while they were in Vietnam. But not all of us. We went there representing our country. We went there doing what we were told to do. And that's the only way that the military can operate. There is no 4 or 5 generals saying, no, I don't agree with that, no, I don't agree with that, I ain't gonna do that, I ain't gonna. Politicians can do that, but generals can't. And if there's anything that I would like to see, if it can be done, is that people, when you see, I get it, I got it yesterday morning, I wore my hat, I got a Vietnam hat that I wear all the time. I wore it to Menards yesterday, on my little weekly trip to buy things at Menards. And I had 2 different people walk up to me and thank me for my service. All right? Now it isn't that I'm wearing my hat so people can come up to me and thank me. It's I'm wearing my hat because I would like people to change their attitude about the guys that served in Vietnam. That's why I wear my hat.
When did that change? Because you said when you first came home, people really didn't respect you for what you did.
I don't think it's changed completely.
Not completely?
No.
Okay.
Because I still think there's a segment of society that looks at that as, not as bad, not as much. Because one of the things that happened with 9/11, all right, we were attacked, okay?
Yes.
And so then the aftermath of that, then the Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan situations were more accepted than Vietnam and Korea to a degree, but especially Vietnam. It changed, 9/11 changed the outlook, or changed the people's perception of what was going on. Those veterans didn't get the same treatment as us guys, us veterans, soldiers from Vietnam did. The sentiment was different. And but as far as Vietnam is concerned, I still think there's a number of occasions to where they could recognize the Vietnam vets a little better than what they're doing.
The anti-war movement made it especially hard for these soldiers to come home because they treat these soldiers as symbols of war itself instead of as individuals. And although these people were a part of the Vietnam War, they were just following orders. It was especially hard for the African American people that were in Vietnam because they often received double discrimination because of their skin color. Even within their military, when they were at Vietnam, they would often get assigned to the most dangerous roles. You were the guy that took care of the petroleum and the ammunition. What would you say were some other jobs that other people had that you know of?
First of all, the people that we over there that we called grunts. Now they were the soldiers that were on the ground doing the fighting. All right? And my experiences with them, with their hardships and whatnot, my experiences with them helped me. I run across a great deal of pilots and co-pilots and crew chiefs and people that were in support of flying helicopters, all the way down to clerks in the office scheduling things, and the kind of cooperation that you would see to make things work. Pilots, co-pilots, crew chiefs, just ordinary people doing extraordinary things. There wasn't very many tanks there, but there was artillery. No, they were mostly what they call 105 howitzers, and those were decent sized guns that were on the ground that shot shells probably the distance, probably within a mile or two or maybe longer. The bigger guns, the guns with longer barrels could go farther. There was times where I think they could shoot a shell at 20 miles. Now that's a long ways. And one of the situations is that you didn't see that happen very often because of the lack of control. Now when artillery was being used along with mortars, those things had to be witnessed. There had to be a spotter, a forward spotter, and that forward spotter would tell the gunners where their shells were landing, and then giving them coordinates to make adjustments to where they wanted the shells to go. All of that was there.
Gotcha.
Those are things that when you look at television today, and you see the big one is the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, and you'll see pictures of those guns being used, whatnot, of some type of artillery being used, whether it be on a mobile tank or whether they be in a fixed position, and all of those things take coordination.
Along with all that equipment, the U.S. soldier was equipped with the M16 rifle, which they picked this specifically because it was lightweight, and they also used M60 machine guns, which I'm sure obviously are a lot heavier than the rifles. One thing that stuck out to me as I was researching this was that the boots that they used, they designed them specifically to have steel plates in the soles of their boots to protect them against punji stakes, which I hope I'm saying that right, but punji stakes are basically just bamboo sticks that they would make, put them in the ground, and basically soldiers would step on them and they have poison on them and they would injure them, hopefully.
Probably Vietnam, and for this country, along with partially Korean War, but Vietnam for this country was a really traumatic experience for a lot of people. And probably the single biggest reason for the upheaval in this country is because I considered anyway is that the politicians never relinquished control over the situation of going to war. And I have never seen, and it sadly enough it still continues to where politicians think that they know more than the generals do, and they have a habit of pushing their agenda instead of. I think it was said best by Ronald Reagan in 1981 when he was addressing the situation and he said that he would, as president, never send the young people of America to go anywhere to fight without the willingness to win. And that was part and parcel what happened in Vietnam. And the politicians weren't going to let the generals do what they know how to do, and that's a fight a war.
Thank you so much for watching. This concludes the video that I'm making for this project, and I know that it's probably just going to be my teacher that sees this video, but if by chance someone else does happen to stumble across this video, one thing that I've learned over this project is that there is still a lot of disrespect for our war veterans, and so I would encourage you, just at wherever you are, Myers or Walmart, wherever you might be, if you see someone that is a war veteran, I would encourage you just to walk up to them and say, thank you for your service. Because I know personally throughout this project that I've been working on, I have gained a lot more respect for the veterans of our country. And I know that the United States of America would not be in the place that it is today without them.